All right, I've heard good things about this. So, without further ado, let's do this.
Another day of wasting any time. I've got a lot to say, can't hold it in this time. No filter, I got no filter, no filter.
There's a lie the Germans started telling after Russia invaded Ukraine. It goes something like this. We Germans, because of the legacy of Ostpolitik, naively put our faith in the precepts of liberal IR theory, which states that the more countries do business with each other, the less likely they are to go to war with each other. And it was because of that faith that Germany intertwined its industrial sector with Russian natural resources, in the hopes that it would deter Russia from getting aggressive with Europe.
That's not how that works, okay? Like it's a lot more complicated than that. Like the European Union was, well, NATO was created to keep Germany down, because Germany, for the longest time, well, in recent history at least, was considered the aggressive country. Russia was not actually considered in Europe the most aggressive country. That was reserved for Germany, or more specifically, the Prussian component of Germany, the one that united Germany before World War I, because there was no such thing as a united Germany before. You had a lot of different little fiefdoms, kingdoms, duchies, and then came Prussia and united those into Germany. And then that united Germany invaded France. But was it before? Yeah, it was before. Because first you had the Prussian-Austrian War, I believe, which Austria had lost. Then you had the unification of Germany. And then you had the invasion onto France, which created the seething hatred that France had for Germany, which in turn influenced the peace negotiations that happened in 1919. That is the timeline. So remember, Germany was considered a militaristic, aggressive place in Europe up until World War II. And some far-right politicians actually still use the rhetoric of aggressive Germany in domestic Polish politics. I think I'm going to make a segment about this because very recently the Polish president has made a speech in which he said, well, he announced the defense of the western border, okay? There was a commemoration of a very famous Polish uprising, the only successful Polish uprising in history, I might add. And the Polish president did not skip a beat to speak about securing the western border against dangers from Germany. Actually, the far right in Poland has created a whole narrative about Germany rebuilding its empire and wanting to conquer Poland, but that's neither here nor there. We're not here to talk about that today. The fact is that it is misguided to think that business alone will deter aggressive countries from wanting to expand, especially when it comes to Russia. And the thing that kept Germany down is not just business, okay? There's a lot more. It's the fact that Germany was not the most powerful thing after countries united under a union, the European Union and NATO. If there was a structure akin to if Russia was surrounded by a bunch of countries that would have relatively similar strength to it, then it probably could not be as aggressive as it is now. It could not be. This is exactly why the so-called CIS has failed. Well, what does CIS stand for? The Commonwealth of Independent States, I think. Like it was supposed to be the Eastern Europe slash friends. It used to be the ex-Soviet Union countries equivalent of the European Union. It was a military and economy. It was a whole, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was decided that a big bloc that would unite those countries economically and militarily would be created. and that countries that used to be in the Soviet Union would join it. Ukraine joined it, actually. And it turned out to be a failure, and the big reason for it was that Russia took on a very dominant and bullying role in this whole endeavor. There was no chance for the other countries to suppress and, well, contain Russia, so to speak, just like the European Union and NATO contained Germany. So I guess we got a little bit of history in.
It would make Germany more dependent
Like, just business is not enough.
on Russian gas, but it would
Especially since we're talking about pretty deep ideological difference as well. Russia is very much opposed to liberalism. Russia is very much opposed to democracy. Russia is opposed to many things on a state level that the degenerate West represents. So definitely there are things that business alone just cannot. There are certain gaps that doing business as usual cannot bridge, as Trump is learning throughout this year. Okay, you cannot just throw business proposals and hope for the best and confidently think that it'll solve the entire problem. Okay?
also make Russia more dependent on Germany for hard currency. There's one problem, though. The Nord Stream pipelines weren't built to increase Germany and Russia's interdependency. You see, the pipelines weren't actually built to increase the volume of gas going from Russia to Germany. Physical capacity had never been the constraint. The volume of Russia's interdependence. There's one problem, though. Yes, but it would also mean getting aggressive with Europe. Sure, it would make Germany more dependent on Russian gas, but it would also make Russia more dependent on Germany for hard currency. There's one problem, though. The Nord Stream pipelines weren't built to increase...
Oh, by the way, the Nord Stream pipelines was something that Poland was opposed to from day one. Poland was opposed to Nord Stream. Even if Germany tries to spin a tale of Poland or any other countries in the region never opposing Nord Stream, yeah, those countries did oppose it. And also, I'm not sure if this YouTuber is going to state it outright, but Nord Stream were built to bypass those countries. Poland and a few others. Russia did it to bypass them, not to need to go through their territory anymore.
And Russia's interdependency. You see, the pipelines weren't actually built to increase the volume of gas going from Russia to Germany. Physical capacity had never been the constraint. Rather, the Baltic Sea pipelines were designed to be a replacement rather than an addition to the network of already existing overground pipelines.
There you go. Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. There you go. That was the whole purpose of the Nord Stream, to just bypass those countries.
Because those overground pipelines travel over Ukraine and Poland, and since around
Exactly.
2004, when Yushchenko became president of Ukraine, Putin has throttled gas deliveries through those pipelines as a political tool, which in turn cuts off Western Europe. The Nord Stream pipelines are there so that the German economy doesn't get hurt when Russia gets into a political dispute with Ukraine or Poland. That's not an increase in interdependence between Germany and Russia, it's a decrease in interdependence between Germany and Russia on one side and Poland and Ukraine on the other. If you go by the theory of naive liberalism about how trade reduces the risk of war, theoretically what the Germans would be doing is making a Russian invasion of Ukraine more likely. That's why the countries of Eastern Europe complained so bitterly about the Nord Stream pipeline. It wasn't...
Yep. And Germany tried to deny that, by the way. So, we're like, nobody complained when we were doing it. Yeah, Poland did.
That the Germans were naive liberals and the Eastern Europeans were hard-nosed realists. Rather, the Eastern Europeans saw it as the Germans intentionally making a war more likely according to their shared liberal IR precepts, which is exactly what the Germans were doing. Knowingly. They just did it anyway because they wanted the money. And it's easy to take calculated risks with someone else's country.
True. I agree so far. So far, this video is on point. That is exactly what happened. And that is exactly what we, the countries of the region, knew it would happen.
The importance of that pipeline wasn't that it made Germany vulnerable to Russian economic warfare.
And this is, by the way, why when Germany demanded the extradition of the person, the Ukrainian suspect of blowing up Nord Stream 2, Poland refused to do it. Poland refused to give up that suspect. And this created a lot of tension between Poland and Germany recently.
Importance was that it sent the signal to Russia that Germany was ready and willing to sell the Ukrainians out in case of war. And that goes straight to what the war in Ukraine is about. The West, and even the Ukrainians themselves to some extent, didn't take the job of deterring a full-blown Russian invasion seriously because they thought Putin must have known somewhere deep inside that Ukraine was a real country and that a war to invade a country of...
Well, it's more than that. To a lot of Ukrainians, like a lot of Ukrainian people, for a while... I'm gonna continue when I drink. There were quite a lot of Ukrainian people that actually believed in the whole Russia and Ukraine being brotherly nations crap. A lot of people that I interviewed actually said that they were shocked when the invasion happened, that they did not believe that it would happen, that there was a lady that I remember interviewing that said that she used to think that Ukraine having a military was just unnecessary. Why spend money on the military in Ukraine when we have Russia to protect us? She actually said that she genuinely thought like that. And then the full-scale invasion happened and whoops. That did not pan out, did it? That ended up in a mess. Okay. But yeah, a lot of people actually believed it, actually thought, yeah, Russia's on our side. We're actually very close. We're brotherly nations. A lot of us speak Russian. We have relatives in Russia. So why would they attack us? Why would they be against us? And then bam, the very rude awakening. Okay. There was a very, very brutal awakening. And then suddenly all those relatives in Russia started playing defense for the full-scale invasion, but that's neither here nor there. I also interviewed quite a lot of people that said that their relatives cheered on Russia as their daughters, sons, grandchildren were bombed. Like one lady told me that she was on the phone chatting with her father who lives in Russia. And she was like, we're getting bombed. We're hiding in the basement right now. And the father's response was, yeah, well, Ukraine deserves it. Okay, I think it's a good thing that your city is being bombed. You know? The lady hiding in the basement with the guy's grandchildren. Insanity. Insane. But, you know, that is one of the tragedies of this conflict.
40 million people could be made unwinnable with minimal effort, but the Russians don't think Ukraine is a real country. So unless the West pulled out all the stops to intervene, they assumed Ukraine would just fall over like a house of
I mean, Russia also doesn't think that Poland is a real country. Russia thinks that all Slavic countries are basically just Russia. Actually, I've started encountering these things on Twitter. Those diagrams that say that Polish people are actually Russians because DNA-wise, Polish people come from further east, so it's all Russians.
parts. Deterring Russia would have required something extreme, and no one wanted to make that commitment.
The president is
Also, I've read very early biographies of Putin. Like those very early biographies that were written by people, and it's so disturbing to read them. Do you know why? Very early in Putin's career, people have written and published biographies, And do you know what the most depressing and disturbing thing about those biographies is? Okay, that the authors straight up wrote, okay, the authors of those biographies straight up wrote, yeah, Putin is kind of cracking down on freedom. He is cracking down on freedom of the press. He's cracking down on freedom of speech. But you know what? Western countries are sort of turning a blind eye on it because we want to do business. I'm like, what? Holy shit. That is so depressing that everybody knew from the very start. Nobody even pretended not to see it. Nobody pretended not to understand what kind of person Putin was. Like the biographers literally just wrote, everybody's pretending not to see that Putin is destroying democracy within Russia, but business is business, money is money. Okay, and now we are where we are.
Expected to warn President Putin there will be real costs if Russia invades Ukraine.
We have made clear to Moscow that we will respond resolutely.
Well, no, you know what? That's a lie. Nobody responded resolutely. If the response really was resolute, then we would not be now in this mess with Trump. This shitty mess that I'm going to be talking about later. That's going to be a segment. Oh my God, if that's going to be a segment among segments.
Including with a range of what we have called high impact economic measures that we've reframed.
Those sound effects are so fitting. Oh my God, the shadow fleet is still operating. In fact, I'm going to say it. Ukraine has imposed harsher sanctions than the West by attacking the refineries and attacking the shadow fleet directly, okay? Economic measures. That's so pathetic. It is so pathetic that Russia has been able to just brush off the sanctions. I mean, not brush off the sanctions. The sanctions are hurtful, but Russia's much better off than it should be. Okay, it's much better off. And of course, don't get me started on the military aid. The little bit of a drip aid that's been given to Ukraine. That kind of sort of helped it to survive, but was not enough for it to win. And now we're in the peace talks. The peace talks that are not going anywhere. Trump is, of course, saying that we are closer to peace than ever before. We're making strides. We're closer than ever for a breakthrough. But you know what? I don't buy it. Especially after today, I don't buy it. You're going to hear all the reasons. I'm going to list all the reasons why I've been saying all along that those negotiations will not lead anywhere. And I will be continuing to report on the war going into the upcoming year. That's going to be happening. Sorry to say.
From using in the past.
So, Russia invaded Ukraine.
Oh, the video is talking about that. But I want to talk about that on my own. Oh, it's from 3 days ago. So no, the video cannot talk about that. The video cannot talk about what happened today. Okay? The video is not going to be talking about certain things. So I guess I still have a chance for a separate segment. There's still a chance for me to say something original that the video will not say. I'm still useful. I'm still useful over here. All right, I'm not useless.
It started before dawn. Ukraine woke to explosions around the capital, Kiev.
The months-long build-up of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine.
Oh yeah, actually, I actually thought in 2014 that Russia would go all in for some reason. I actually was kind of worried in 2014 that Russia would not stop and would just move further into Ukraine. That was actually a thing that Polish people were worried about. all the way back when the war in Donbass started.
Has turned now into an invasion.
But then a weird thing happened. To understand it, though, you have to understand Russia's war goals. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, they were hoping to overthrow the government and replace it with one that would be more Lukashenkoan.
I was about to say that. I mean, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that Russia wanted to turn Ukraine into Belarus 2.0. That was a thing already back in 2014. That is what people talk about when they speak of the Euromaidan. That is, they say that they just didn't want to end up like Belarus. And that's true. But of course, there will always be brain-dead idiots from the West that will say that it was a coup, that it was all backed by the CIA, the phone call, and all that crap. But the reality is that Ukrainian people just simply did not want to end up like Belarus.
An action which the Kremlin thought would be greeted with either cheers or at least indifference from regular...
Like Belarus is separate from Russia, just in name at this point. In all but name.
Ukrainian citizens. When it was clear that couldn't happen, what then was Russia fighting for? Well, when they're asked, they don't really give straight answers.
А берем мы Киев или не берем, а может до Берлина дойдем, а может быть до Лиссабона. Надо бы сказать конкретно. Не надо говорить конкретно.
They can't give a straight answer, of course. Because the real answer is...
Well, it's not about not being able to give a straight answer. They usually just give 5 or 6 different straight answers. One is the defense of the Russian speakers, like defense against the genocide of the Russian speakers in the eastern parts of Ukraine, which is very interesting considering that those very same Russian speakers are being bombed now every single day. The second is NATO expansion. That's also one of the reasons that Russia gives regularly about why it invaded. Satanism, believe it or not, has been given as a reason for the full-scale invasion. I've heard Russian politicians and pundits talk about the rise of Satanism in Ukraine. And then you have the denazification angle. We have to denazify Ukraine. That's reason number 4. Anti-LGBT, we're fighting degeneracy. J.K. Rowling is being censored. That actually, unironically, was one of the reasons given by Vladimir Putin himself, was talking about trans people. And of course, there's also one of the newest ones. Very recently, during a speech, Putin said that it was actually the US that invaded Russia via Ukraine. Like, I guess Joe Biden's, because this is important to stress, to appease Trump, that Joe Biden's America invaded Russia by using Ukraine, and then Europe joined in on the invasion. And now the United States president changed. So it is now Trump. And now it's just the warmongering Europe continuing its, I don't know, its road to conquest. It's selfish, despicable, conquest-driven invasion of Russia. Because as we all know, Ukraine is the aggressor and Russia is just defending itself, I guess. So yeah. Yeah. Philip August says, my lefty friend said that the special military operation was launched to end US imperialism and liberate the... Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm. Interesting. If 6 answers are given that aren't enough by themselves, then there's no straight answer. I mean, there are 6 different straight answers given on different occasions.
Is just too humiliating. If they were to just cut their losses and withdraw back to the February 22nd line, the Americans would laugh at them. And clearly sending hundreds of thousands of kids to their death is preferable to that. But when you're only fighting to save face, you can do things like pretend you never intended to sack the capital at all. That losing the entirety of your special forces behind enemy lines in a suburban airport parking lot was just a masterful gambit to distract everyone from the real prize, Sloviansk-Kramatorsk.
True. And also, I still remember that Russian vehicles at the beginning of the war had rotten tires because the maintenance of the equipment was so bad. That was the beginning of the war, was so embarrassing for Russia. Unfortunately for all of us, along the way, Russian troops have been learning, and Russia, as time went on, became more and more competent during this war. But the beginning, oh God, the beginning was so embarrassing. It was horrible.
They also
Thank God.
can't take. Normally, this kind of ass covering would not work, but in this case, in this specific war, Russia found a co-conspirator in its desire to push this narrative: Ukraine. The Ukrainians, of course, know exactly what they've been fighting for, and it was at that moment, when Russia's attack on the capital collapsed, that they saw their ultimate prize, the chance to roll back the clock all the way to 2014. So when Russia started saying that
God, I wish that happened. I wish that happened. That would have been so beautiful. But unfortunately, the incompetence of the West has that goal has.
so long as they didn't lose all the territory they had won in the first few days of the war, they were still winning the war. Ukrainians were eager to agree that so long as Russia still had a foothold in Ukraine, it would still constitute a Russian victory, and therefore Russia would come out of any compromise emboldened to launch further attacks on Ukraine and even other parts of Europe. So, hint hint, the West better send more aid. This is not to say the Ukrainians are wrong. At the end of the day, the perception of power is power. If everyone
I mean, from Polish perspective, I remember the very first days of the invasion, the very first days when I said, and there were people that were saying, no, Lucy, that's not right. You're so wrong about this. And I said, you know what? I actually think that if Poland were to be attacked, if Ukraine lost and Poland were to be attacked, I actually don't think that Western Europe would come in to save Poland. I don't think Article 5 would do jack shit for Poland. I think that the Western countries would say, well, Poland used to be in the Soviet sphere. Do we really want to risk the nuclear war? Do we really want to? Do we though? And now NATO is a little bit less than guaranteed under Donald Trump, and all the things that I've been saying from the first days of the invasion seem to be a lot more on the table for people than back then. Like, I already did not believe that Article 5 would save Poland in 2022 under Biden. And now, what am I supposed to say now under the current political leadership of the United States?
goes with the narrative that Russia won, Russia will be emboldened to do more stupid shit. And for a while, it didn't seem to matter. Ukraine seemed poised to win outright.
Moving overseas, and Ukrainian troops are making major gains in the country's south and northeast, putting Russian forces on the back foot.
Tonight, Ukraine is on the offensive and quickly gaining ground, reclaiming the largest swath of Russian-controlled territory since April.
But after the first
Yes, because Russia was extremely, I have to stress this, I cannot stress this enough, Russia was extremely incompetent when it invaded. It actually, Russian soldiers apparently expected to be greeted with flowers. I still remember this little anecdote from the beginning of the war when Russian soldiers were talking to civilians, and there was some implication that they were told that they'd be poisoned. They were the invaders.
victories, a new problem started to crop up. By winning, Ukraine was whittling away its opportunities to, well, win. What was working to Ukraine's advantage was that the Russians were overstretched. The Russians lost control of 7% of Ukrainian territory, about 16,000 square miles, and were forced back to the east side of the Dnieper River. But by being pushed back across the river, the Russians suddenly had 300 fewer kilometers it needed to defend, and 16,000 square miles it no longer needed to occupy. For any further offensive, the Ukrainians would be increasingly pushing a boulder uphill. But conversely, Russia's in no position to take advantage and strike back, because Russia is fighting a war.
And of course, there's the problem that like there was a lot of wasted opportunity here. The fact that the West is so afraid of Russia's nuclear potential. Yeah, we cannot forget about that ever. That it's all about that nuclear escalation ladder. And the fact that Europe and the United States have not been the best when it comes to the timely delivery of aid and, of course, the quantity of the aid delivered.
War of conquest. It can advance without committing more troops and resources behind the line in order to manage its occupation, which is why, since 2022, Russia has launched its offensive almost exclusively through barren fields and small towns. Every advance mobilizes more Ukrainians to fight, because more territorial defense units get activated, and Ukrainians in the West get more nervous about the general outcome of the war and are willing to take on more risk. Even with America out of the war, Russia just doesn't have the tools to capture a city of 1 million like Zaporizhia, let alone hold it, even though, on paper, it's already been annexed to Russia. This combination of forces just kind of lends itself to a stalemate. The battle line is settled on an equilibrium point where Russia and Ukraine are equally matched.
This war has now become a war of attrition, where the Ukrainians are paying a high price.
The mid-wit interpretation of this situation is that Russia has to win such a war of attrition because it's bigger and has more stuff. So obviously,
I mean, technically speaking, if the West, how should I say it? If the West pulled its shit together, then Ukraine would have more stuff. And the fact that, again, Russia is more, how should I put it? Russia has more dependable allies than Ukraine. Like, it is very sad that Iran, North Korea, and China, of course, let's not forget, China may say that it doesn't, but it absolutely does support Russia. There are more dependable allies. North Korea has been giving weapons in big quantities to Russia. North Korea has been giving troops to Russia. Iran has been giving drones to Russia in pretty big quantities. And now, based on the blueprints, Russia is producing their own Shaheeds. And of course, there's China buying Russia's energy and delivering components for Russian weapons industry. It's a mess. And while in the meantime, the West has been dripping aid, while also buying energy from Russia, by the way. So this whole thing has been a giant embarrassing mess. The support for Ukraine from the West has been lackluster. And now the United States under Trump just became an ally of Russia.
And will run out first. But there are good reasons to think a war of attrition actually favors Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war, which means it loses materiel and men at a much lower rate, and it can more easily mobilize its economy to total war since there's much less internal dissension compared to Moscow. Ukraine isn't already mobilizing now because it doesn't have to, because Russia is also afraid of throwing in too many resources.
Yeah.
So while Russia's cheering section in the media is sure Russia will win a war of attrition, the Russian Ministry of Defense is a lot less confident. So Russia tried to make up for what it couldn't get on the battlefield by using psychological pressure, by which I mean, of course, killing random civilians.
New burst of grief in Ukraine's increasingly under fire capital. Relatives mourn not at gravesides, but by the newly cut.
This is exactly what my current trip has been about, by the way. Doing interviews with people that have been victims of such attacks. I've interviewed families that have survived such attacks. And of course, they have told me a lot about their dead neighbors, about the dead children, about, all of the consequences. I've interviewed a small 8-year-old girl that needed 3 surgeries after such a drone attack. And no, I'm not afraid. I'm not at this point. I'm not afraid, like, at all. Maybe I'll be more afraid if I start doing more risky stuff, but no. So yeah, I'm hoping to do more interviews with civilian victims of such attacks, drones, missiles, and mines, with a focus on child victims.
The bodies of the dead, a 9-year-old girl, her mother, and another woman killed on Children's Day.
And well, it works. Constant daily drone.
The saddest part of it all is that when I interviewed people that died during an attack on the Children's Cancer Hospital, apparently the Children's Cancer Hospital was not the only place that was attacked that day. A building block was attacked as well. 13 people in that building died, and I think 5 children. There were 5 children among the victims, and the saddest thing of all is that quite a few people during that attack, during that strike on the building block, were refugees that survived by escaping the most attacked cities in the East during the beginning of the war. There were people from Mariupol, for example, that became refugees by running away from Mariupol. They survived Mariupol only to be killed by a missile in Kyiv. What a twist. What a cruel twist, right?
Drone attacks take a hell of a toll on people's sanity. Ukrainians started to doubt that they could make it through the war without losing it long enough to win a war of attrition, even while the line stood perfectly firm on the battlefield. So Ukraine increasingly, desperately started looking to the Americans not just to give them the tools to survive, but the tools to roll back the Russian occupation in toto, and quickly. But the Pentagon was sort of at a loss for how to provide that.
In terms of their ability to win, the first step in winning is believing that you can win.
You see, here's the thing. At the risk of making sweeping generalizations about a subject about which I have no real-world experience, as far as I can tell, the American Army doesn't really have a ground war doctrine. On paper it has a ground war doctrine, but in practice, America's ground war doctrine is...
Thanks to the global coalition, including all of you here today, and to our other partners.
Together with our partners, America is training and equipping the Syrian opposition to be a counterweight.
Together with our partners.
With our partners.
Our partners.
Our partners. Our partners. With our partners.
Yeah, but America does have a military industry, okay? It can produce weapons. So it also has thousands upon thousands of tanks that it could be given to Ukraine. So let's not bullshit ourselves and try to pretend that the US just does not have weapons to give. Yes, it does. It is given a pittance of an amount of tanks that it could be given. For example, Poland has given more tanks than any single country, than any single of Ukrainian allies, which is embarrassing. It should be embarrassing for the United States.
And someone else to be the ground.
I'm not saying this to super brag about Poland. I've always found it embarrassing that Poland gave the biggest amount of tanks, actually.
So America can stick to close air support and logistics. This means the US has plenty of small arms and plenty of ultra high-tech super weapons, but very little of the meat and potatoes in between. But that middling type of equipment...
That's not exactly true. That's not exactly true. The United States has had a lot of things in its storage that is going to be getting rid of anyway, that it just is not giving. The tanks would be the great example. It has a ton of tanks.
The self-propelled artillery, the counter-battery radars, the short-range ballistic missiles are exactly what Ukraine needs. And it's not like there are factories around just waiting to pump out more of them. So the Pentagon is nervous about giving away too much. The advanced weapons can't be sent because America wants to protect its tech secrets.
I'm sorry, but the Pentagon very recently has said that giving some of these things would not actually affect the US military in a substantial way. And yet Trump will not do it. So even that's not exactly true. Okay, let's just come on. Let's not pretend that the U.S. does not have the capacity to give Ukraine what it needs. All of a sudden,
America didn't want to send long-range missiles for fear of
like that, the United States could not really engage its weapons industry. Okay. Also, there's Korea. Like, let's come on.
triggering a Russian retaliation against NATO. And I suspect the White House thought Ukraine would be capable of developing their own long-range weapon systems that would let them off the hook. Altogether, NATO was basically betting on a strategy of bleeding the Russians dry with defensive tactics until Putin gives up. A perfectly rational strategy, so long as you ignore the human cost to Ukraine. Trapped between the pressure to end the war created by Russian terror bombings and the inability of America to win the war for him.
Also, this video completely ignores the fact that Ukraine has been given what it needs in very small quantities over usually too late. Ukraine would say, hey, we need this type of weapon. And then the negotiations would begin. Should we give it to Ukraine? How much should we give to Ukraine? Do we agree to give it to Ukraine? And then they would say, okay, we vote and we agree to give it to Ukraine. It'll arrive in Ukraine in a couple of months. And by the time that it would arrive in Ukraine in much smaller quantities than it should, Russia has had already plenty of time to prepare for it. Like, this is an aspect that just cannot be ignored. This is one of the biggest disappointments about the entirety of the Western aid, not just the US.
Zelensky turned to a long-shot strategy to maintain the narrative momentum of the war. He was going to have to launch another daring offensive. But where to do it? The low-hanging fruit had already been picked. There were really only two areas in Ukraine where an assault would be plausible. The Donbass, where Russia was throwing the mass of its troops in an ongoing offensive, or the south, behind which lied the land bridge that connected Crimea to the rest of Ukraine, and by extension, Russia's most important supply line. The Ukrainians decided to hit the south. It was the most obvious place to hit. The Russians had their troops concentrated elsewhere, the land is flat, and the territory is of vital importance. The problem, though, is that the south was the most obvious place to hit. The Russians had their troops concentrated elsewhere, the land is flat, and the territory is of vital importance, which means the Russians were expecting to be hit there. So the second the Russians retreated across the river, they started building line after line of defensive earthworks. The more time they had to prepare, the thicker the defenses got.
Also, when it comes to this infamous counteroffensive of 2023, there's a lot to be said how the United States provided strategies that were impossible to implement with what Ukraine has been given. Okay? It was just, for example, without air dominance. It was ridiculous. The advice that was given by American military personnel to Ukraine. Just
the assault, time would be
plans that were impossible to implement.
Of the essence. But up to that point, the Americans hadn't been training the Ukrainians on quote-unquote offensive weapons. Doing it now would take months, giving the Russians lots of time. But with no better ideas to go on, Ukraine began preparations for an offensive in the spring. In the meantime, a quiet bureaucratic fight started to break out inside the Ukrainian military between the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, and the commander of the ground forces, Oleksandr Syrsky. While Zaluzhny was in charge of the overall war effort, Syrsky was in charge of the Donbass front. Syrsky became convinced that with enough extra troops, he could rout the Russian mercenaries of Wagner Group in the eastern town of Bakhmut and push deep into occupied Luhansk. But Zaluzhny had already committed himself to a plan to push south, with only a small diversionary attack in the east, reserving all of his new, specially trained by the American recruits for the main front. But when spring finally came, nothing. The Americans were late with some of the aid, and Zelensky didn't want to risk putting the army in the position of fighting the first half of the battle, only to be left empty-handed during the second half. So he waited, again, against the wishes of his commanders, and the Americans. It was at this point, allegedly, that Syrsky went behind his superior's back to Zelensky and personally promised him that Bakhmut could be a big showy victory. that Wagner was on the cusp of breaking, and if he, Syrski, were just given some of those specially trained American troops, he could lead a breakthrough behind the lines into Luhansk province and rout the Russians on the entire east. Given the delay, Zelensky was probably losing confidence in the original offensive plan, but not wanting the bad PR of calling it off, he chose the worst of both worlds. He split his forces up and gave a third of them to Syrski for his Bakhmut offensive. Instead of trying for a defeat in detail, the Ukrainians would fight undermanned on two different fronts. But for a second it seemed to work.
А теперь слушайте меня, сука, блядь. Это чьи-то, блядь, отцы.
The mercenary company in charge of defending Bakhmut, the Wagner Group, took such bad losses that its leader...
My first video that's gonna be released on the new channel is gonna be an interview with a 16-year-old from Bakhmut.
Yevgeny Prigozhin began threatening other ministers of the government and implicitly even Putin himself, culminating in Prigozhin's decidedly silly decision of
But I think while this video is not bad, I'm gonna say that it's very, very forgiving of the West's failures when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Like, this video is very lenient when it comes to pointing out the shortcomings of the West, of its aid, of its strategies provided to Ukraine. Okay? Like the whole thing, oh, the US just does not have the ground force capability. It just could not give Ukraine what it needed. Okay, bullshit. I'm sorry.
Overthrow the Russian government.
Hours earlier, Wagner forces seized the city of Rostov-on-Don on Russia's southern border.
And then calling it off when he got halfway there, and pretending it was just a sort of coup-like performance art protest.
By nightfall, Wagner forces appeared to be making good on their word to withdraw. The
Oh my
Kremlin
gosh.
was also making peace,
The Wagner thing.
saying Prigozhin will no longer face
Prigozhin was just saying, oh, I'm not going against Putin. I'm not going against Putin. I'm just going against the oligarchs. Please, please, I'm loyal to Putin. I'm loyal to Putin while marching on Moscow. That was so glorious. I still remember when that was happening. Of course, we all knew that it would not really lead to anything, as always, but it was very entertaining to see as it was unfolding, that's for sure.
criminal charges and
I
instead
still
will
remember.
relocate to next door Belarus.
The missile that shot down his plane and killed him, however, did not stop halfway.
Oops.
Russia's political system remained stable, and Syrski's legacy would seem to primarily be memes about Prigozhin. With the hope of Russian political instability saving the day dashed, and the main offensive force too undermanned to break through, the offensive sputtered to a halt on both fronts.
Yeah.
The failed offensive was not a particularly big disaster when it came to the actual balance of forces on the battlefield, but it had a catastrophic effect on Western public opinion. Within a month, support for aid to Ukraine dropped 13 points and opposition rose 12 points, almost reaching a majority. All the people who had tacitly supported Russia before the invasion, but who during the war had to keep their heads down after the slaughter started, suddenly started feeling safe popping their heads back up again to start spreading defeatism.
Yeah.
And the foreign policy blob in Washington, whose first instinct is always towards power worship, started nattering about how Ukrainians need to be more realistic and start thinking about compromises. This damage to American resolve was then compounded by Zelensky's need to explain away the failure of the offensive to his own people, which Zelensky did by blaming the West. Since after all, the West had been late with the aid, and had been dragged.
I mean, I'm sorry to say, he's not incorrect. I'm sorry to say, but the West has been slow in delivering the aid, slow in delivering the quantities that Ukraine needs. It has been slow in delivering the types of weapons that Ukraine needed. The United States intelligence, or rather the United States military, has been feeding when it comes to the offensive strategies that were just impossible to implement because Ukraine did not have the types of equipment needed to pull off such offensives. You can go to a fellow streamer, Daedalus Media, okay, for that breakdown. I'm sorry, but the West was partially to blame for that counteroffensive. There's just no escaping it.
dragging their
Like, again, it's very embarrassing that Iran and North Korea and China are better delivers of aid to Russia than the West to Ukraine.
On the aid the entire war. But that sent the message to Ukraine's try-hard cheerleaders in the West that they should start ringing the alarm bells about America betraying the Ukrainians by withholding this or that wonder weapon. A given type of equipment would be paradigm shifting.
Okay. Now this video is actually being a bit dishonest. But also Zelensky had the tools to understand that the offensive would not be successful with his available resources. It's not that simple. Like when the West says we will send you this, that, or the other, and then delays the thing, delays the shipments, etc. Then, you know, like part of the reason why Zelensky did the delay that he did was because he understood that it could not be done with the resources available. But then the video says, oh, Zelensky delayed and blamed the delays from the West. So should he have just went knowing that it could not have been done? Or should he have just like called off the entire thing knowing that the West is just not reliable? Vladimir says, but Lucy, blaming the West is bad optics. Have you considered that? Oh, I forgot myself. Like, this is... And this whole talking about wonder weapons is dishonest. I'm sorry. I'm gonna say that the video is being... You cannot just call things off in a war like that. It's not that simple, once again. Things are not that simple in a war that you can just call things off at a leisure or call it, you know, delay or call it off at a leisure. And the wonder weapon thing is just dishonest, okay? It's not about it being a wonder weapon. It's about it being a crucial weapon that works good in tandem with all other weapons, okay? And if you don't have that weapon that you're asking for, that type of weapon that you're asking for that is necessary to work in tandem with all the other weapons, then it will affect how the war goes. I'm sorry to say. Okay? It's not about wonder weapons.
Right up until the point that the West delivered it, at which point, just coincidentally, it would suddenly be too late for that equipment to make it.
Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. This is very much apologia for the West. Okay? Yeah, there are windows. There are time windows for such things. We need this weapon now, right now. But if you delay, of course Russia is going to prepare for it. Of course Russia is going to prepare countermeasures. It's not convenient. It's reality. Oh, Ukraine said that there is this crucial time window that they need this specific type of weapon for to attack Russia's this or that. But just because the West delayed it by a couple of months, suddenly it was too late. Yes, it was. Yeah, it was actually suddenly too late. Yeah.
When, in reality, such equipment would only have a marginal impact on the course of the war.
Yeah, it would have, but it would have had an impact in tandem with all the other types of weapons. Nobody ever said that it was a wonder weapon, that it would have changed the tide of the war. Again, this is dishonest. Nobody said that. Least of all Ukraine. Ukraine did not say, oh, give us this now and we will win. Ukraine said, this type of weapon is necessary for us on this part of the front line right now. Okay? In tandem with all the other things that we've got at our disposal. Not this is a wonder weapon that will win us the war. And now it's too late for us to win the war with it.
This game of two-step is a perfect way to squeeze more aid out of a hyper-cautious White House, but it also involved a lot of cycling between false promises the war would be turned around and false threats that the front would collapse soon without the new weapons. If this campaign to shift blame to the White House had simply made the relationship between Biden and Zelensky frosty, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But the focus on the catastrophic consequences of a Ukrainian collapse and the panicky tone much of it was delivered gave the impression that Ukraine was on the brink of giving up. This was being...
I'm sorry, how about the fact that the West throughout this war has been saying, we cannot send this type of weapon, we cannot send that type of weapon, we cannot send too much of the weapon because that would be escalation. Why does this video not, talk about the constant fear of escalation that the West has been blabbering about since the beginning of the war? Why are we completely ignoring this aspect? That Russia would say, hey, if you send this type of weapon, it'll be escalation, it'll be bad. And the West would react with saying, oh shit, that's true. We cannot escalate. Escalating too much is bad. Giving Ukraine too much is bad. Are we going to pretend that has not been the case? Really? We're really going to pretend that that's not been the West's policy? Germany very stubbornly for just refusing to send missiles to Ukraine, among other things. Like, come on. Don't make me laugh. It is like this whole, oh yeah, Ukraine is just to blame. It's just fearmongers, tries to squeeze out more aid, and it's all because of Ukraine, because the West has been doing some delays, just because a little bit of less than it promised, North Korea sends artillery in quantity and on time. Somehow. This is pathetic. This video is starting to piss me off, actually. What can I say?
Done in the hope that it would scare the West into giving up more aid. But there's one problem, which is that you can't control who hears you say these things. If you broadcast a message in the West that you don't have the will to fight unless you get substantially more help, you're also
Ukraine has not been saying that, and I've been following this war from the beginning. Actually, what Ukraine has been saying all this time is, we will fight whether we get aid or not. We will continue fighting even if all the aid dries up. Not, we will not have the will, not if we will not get the aid. I have no idea where this person got this impression from.
Message to the Russians, thus bolstering their will to fight. The second problem is that this revival of domino theory in Europe didn't convince Americans of the necessity of bolstering Ukrainian aid, so much as it convinced Americans that
Yeah, because the West, once again, has been shaking in its boots against escalation. The escalation ladder has been dominated by Russia firmly. The nuclear escalation ladder, that is. It is the part of the nuclear deterrence theory that says that, in theory, both sides should have this balance when it comes to the threat of using nuclear weapons. But Russia has been keeping a very firm advantage when it comes to this, which meant that the West has been willing to do much less for Ukraine than it should, out of fear of escalation.
Europe was helpless and not carrying its own weight. After all, why the hell should a place as rich as Europe be so vulnerable to a second-rate power like Russia? In 2023, it seemed every week military analysts who had spent early 2022 predicting Ukraine would collapse in 3 days were now assuring us with the same confidence 2020 Russia. In 2023, it seemed every week military analysts who had spent early 2022 predicting Ukraine would collapse in 3 days were now assuring us with the same confidence that Europe, or at least the Baltics, would also easily fall to a Russian onslaught after Russia was done with Ukraine, and that this was the result of sort of decadent post-historical complacency on the part of the Europeans. In other words, Europeans were just too gay and welfare dependent to spend enough on their military to deter or defeat a Russian attack, and America was spending billions to carry all the weight. In reality, Europe's defenselessness is being just slightly exaggerated. The arguments mostly hinge on the idea that the war in Ukraine supposedly proves that modern war has become an attritional slog. Because after all, the war in Ukraine has become an attritional slog, and Europe does not have large reserves of ready or near-ready fighting vehicles or troops to break out in case of an emergency. So it can safely be assumed Europe will...
Well, Europe's biggest problem is that it does not have a unified military-industrial complex compared to places like the United States, China, or even Russia for that matter. Europe is very fragmented. Europe produces weapons in each individual country, and all of these individual European countries are very eager to keep their domestic infrastructure because it means that they get more profit, because if you produce on scale, then the prices are lower. But if you produce at a lower scale domestically, then you can ask for a higher price and you produce the amount of weapons for a much higher profit. So individual countries' industrial complexes are very not happy about the idea of a big scale restructurization, which would mean that Europe would produce equipment at scale, which is actually what Europe needs. It doesn't mean anything if NATO countries raise their GDP output to 5% for military spending if this problem does not get solved, because Europe will not be getting the bang for its buck. Europe will not be getting as much for the amount that it's spending that it could have if it would streamline and unify its production. That is something that Europe desperately needs to do and is not doing so far, because there are countries, there are so-called Euro-skeptic countries that are against that.
Quickly run out in a war with Russia and fall back. The problem, of course, is that the only reason the war is a slog is that both sides are fighting with last-generation airplanes but current-generation air defense systems. Europe does not have a last-generation air force. They have a modern air force with modern stealth capability. They are not going to be stopped in their tracks by a bunch of Buk launchers. And unlike Russia, Europe has not neglected its naval power. Italy alone has a more powerful
That's
navy
not...
even a post-American rump.
That's not exactly like the naval power thing. The naval power thing is interesting because actually, while Russia might not be a powerhouse when it comes to the navy, Russia has been actually, interestingly enough, hampered a lot at the beginning of the invasion by Turkey. Believe it or not, Turkey has been proven to be quite an interesting, I don't want to say ally to Ukraine, but Turkey has helped Ukraine quite a lot at the very beginning of the invasion when it invoked the Montreux Doctrine, the Montreux thing, when it controls the entry to the Black Sea, and it blocked, this doctrine says that the entry to the Black Sea can be controlled by Turkey in case of a war, and they could block it. And at the beginning of the war, Turkey has effectively blocked a big chunk of the Russian fleet from entering the Black Sea, which would have probably proven very troublesome from Ukraine at the very beginning when Ukraine did not have the drone capability that it has now to attack Russian ships. So things could have been a little bit different when it comes to this war at the Black Sea if Turkey did not do this initial blockade of the Russian fleet.
NATO has a good chance of being able to bottle up most of Russia's water-based trade. And while Europe has been slow to develop its industrial capacity when it comes to helping Ukraine, that is, at its core, a political decision. They're simply prioritizing other things higher. Europeans will suddenly find the power in themselves to build much more quickly once it's their ass on the line. This European freeloader argument also dovetailed with a new line of Russian propaganda that had taken off in the summer of 2023. In the June interview, Vladimir Putin just kind of blithely let it slip that actually...
But it is true that the European military-industrial complex is extremely fragmented, which is something that this person in this video has very much neglected to say, that the United States and Russia for that matter, are able to produce weapons at scale for much cheaper than Europe. That is a fact.
About a month or two after the war started, Ukraine was just about to sign a ceasefire deal, but then pulled out at the last moment under pressure from the West. And this deal was, according to Putin, a more generous deal than what Ukraine could get now.
That's
you see,
not
all
true.
Putin had really wanted was a promise to keep Ukraine out of NATO. He didn't really care about Ukraine's internal affairs,
That's
or
not true.
even if it signed a bilateral defense agreement, so long as it wasn't NATO. This meant, of course, according to Vladimir Putin, Ukraine had the option in the summer of 2022 of ending the war right then and there with good security guarantees and no real obstacle to its European integration.
That's not true.
So, why didn't they take the deal? Well, you see, the people who run American foreign policy are congenitally evil and love war for war's sake, and so they sent their most subtle diplomat, a man who can be trusted to always stay on script, Boris Johnson, to convince Zelensky to walk out on the deal and keep fighting. Needless to say, this is not what happened. In fact, you can pretty quickly deduce what actually led Ukraine to say no by carefully reading the description of the security guarantee clause in the Russian offer.
Yeah.
In this formulation, Ukraine's security partner would be a consortium between certain Western countries and the UN Security Council, with both the UNSC and the other countries needing to agree in order to approve an intervention in Ukraine against any foreign assault. But those countries would only be able to intervene in Ukraine against foreign aggression with the consent of the UNSC. But Russia, of course, has a veto on the Security Council, which means Russia was, under the guise of letting Ukraine have a security agreement, awarding itself a veto on any country's ability to intervene on Ukraine's behalf
course.
if Ukraine were to be
And I'm not even going to mention the whole demilitarization that the peace plan demanded from Ukraine.
invaded by, say, hypothetically, Russia. To turn this into a story of the West sabotaging a promising peace deal to satisfy, Jake Sullivan's inexplicable thirst for blood, or even just a story about the Ukrainians boneheadedly turning down a pretty good deal out of post-victory exuberance, it's perverse. But it lent itself to something people wanted to believe, that Russia was actually more reasonable than it appeared. And there actually was a sustainable ceasefire deal to be made, with the only drawbacks being national pride. Were it only so. This combination of the failed counteroffensive, the resentment of European helplessness, and this new alleged proof that the war had actually been unnecessary, created a new consensus that it was time to force Ukraine to end the war. Or as Americans preferred to formulate it to avoid feeling guilty, it was time for America to stop forcing Ukrainians to fight by giving them the weapons they asked for.
Yeah.
And that new consensus created
That's just pisses me off so much. This narrative, I guess the video is back on track. The video is not totally hopeless, but some of the parts in this video are just has pissed me off, and I pointed out the bits that I didn't like. Vladimir says American MiG is not about affordable weaponry that can be produced on mass scale. It's about bomber, Abrams tanks, and Giga next generation fighter jets for digital helmets and AI interaction. I mean, the United States can produce even the more advanced stuff en masse, actually, because America has shitloads of money. Like, do you know how many Abrams tanks the US has? Let me see. I'm gonna ask the AI for this. How many Abrams tanks does the US have? The US military, primarily the army, has around 4,600 to 5,000 M1 Abrams tanks. So, there you go. Wait, how many Abrams tanks did the US give to Ukraine? The US commanded and delivered 31 Abrams tanks out of 5,000. Amazing aid. Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect way in for a more entrepreneurial politician to pitch his new foreign policy ideas.
I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created, including the horrible war with Russia and Ukraine, which would have never happened if I was president.
Of course.
As he told it now, Americans were victims of a globalist elite and their European allies, who had started and needlessly prolonged the war for abstract ideological reasons like democracy and liberalism. If Donald Trump had been president, the war never would have started, because he's strong, whatever that was supposed to mean. And once he became president again, he would immediately end it, because he was on good terms with Putin, which meant once he got
He
in,
still says that, okay? He still says that he has a good friendship with Vladimir Putin. He still says that if he were president, the war would have never happened. And whenever there is a conversation with Ukraine about ending the war, Trump is always very quick to get on call with Vladimir Putin right before. Always a conversation with Putin right before any negotiations with Ukraine. I wonder why. Oh, I wonder why.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop. I want to save lives. We're in for 250 billion or more.
Fuck me.
Because they don't ask Europe, which is a much bigger beneficiary to getting this thing done than we are. I know Zelensky very well, and I know Putin very well. I have a good relationship, and they respect your president, okay? They respect me. They don't respect Biden. How would you...
Yeah, Putin does not respect Trump in the slightest. If that was not clear, it should be. By now, it should be clear that Putin does not respect Trump at all. Not in the slightest. Not even close.
Why? For what reason? But we have a president,
Mr. President,
that doesn't know he's alive.
Your time.
This rhetorical stance was perfectly designed to trick everyone at once. He could appeal to doves by promising a quick end to the war, with a strong implication that he would do...
We're still not even close to the war being ended, by the way. And the proposed deal is so bad. The proposed peace deal on the table is so bad that I've told this at the beginning of the stream. Polish people don't even say that this peace deal is bad for Ukraine anymore. No. Polish people openly say that this proposed peace deal is bad for Poland. Let that sink in. The countries that's not even directly involved in the war. This peace deal hurts Poland. I rest my case.
Do it by cutting off aid to Ukraine and force them to make concessions to Russia. But simultaneously, he could appeal to hawks by making vague appeals to his toughness, in a way that implied he was going to use a sort of madman theory of diplomacy which would scare Russia into making their concessions. This shouldn't have worked on Ukraine supporters, but the growing schism between Biden and Zelensky and the media campaign to exaggerate the effects of American aid delays had alienated many Ukraine supporters from Biden, and some increased...
I'm sorry to say this. I'm sorry to say this in the wake of how disastrous the Trump presidency is, but it's kind of true. It wasn't just some made up thing. Ukraine was bleeding slowly because of the incompetence of Western aid. I'm sorry that just because things have gotten much worse under Trump does not mean that things were good before Trump. Let's not try to create this imaginary scenario in which we try to tell ourselves that things were good, and then Trump won and they suddenly became bad. No, things were pretty bad, and then they became horrible. That is my little interpretation of the situation.
increasingly started thinking that maybe Trump would be the lesser evil. Either way, Trump would give Americans the thing they wanted most in Ukraine, the ability to not have to see or think about Ukraine in the news anymore. It's that urge, ultimately, that carried him to the White House.
Also, I don't think that Ukraine was primarily the reason why Trump won. I think there were many different reasons why people voted Trump that had nothing to do with Ukraine. I don't think people voted for Trump not to have to see Ukraine in the news. That's a very naive read of the election, actually.
Is this a call?
Like, Trump did not run on Ukraine. Let's not make that mistake.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now projecting that Donald J. Trump will win the state of Pennsylvania.
Now it was time to implement his plan. Or it would be if not for the small problem that he didn't have a plan.
Do you think Donald Trump thought it was going to be this hard, this challenging? I mean, on the campaign trail, he said day one, it'd be fixed.
No, actually, he said that he would do it even before taking office, but that's neither here nor there.
He was asked about this, why he said, in 24 hours he would have a deal, and he said that he was being sarcastic.
Trump's campaign promise version of the plan would never work, of course. It doesn't give Washington enough leverage to force Ukraine to surrender, and Trump was clearly not a madman, so any bluff against the Russians was doomed to fail. And Trump caved to Russia pretty immediately. That left the current plan of just trying to ease the Russians and Ukrainians into a sequence of partial ceasefires and hoping that you can just kick the can down the road where it can trip up the next Democratic administration. But then even that plan blew up.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of approval.
Holy shit. No, he did not. He just visited, he just happened to visit a factory for artillery.
Appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
If you speak very loudly about the war, you
He's
can...
not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No.
Can
You've
I
done a lot
answer?
of talking.
Part of the problem here is
You cannot answer.
that the Trump White House is torn between multiple contradictory campaign promises. On one hand, Donald Trump promised to end the war quickly. On the other hand, the populist right feels that America has been taken advantage of by the globalist elites, and therefore America must be paid back.
Of course.
But putting pressure on Ukraine emboldens Russia to ask for more, which makes Trump feel like a sucker. Which means instead of American pressure on Ukraine being focused on one point of just getting them to make concessions to Russia, the pressure is diverted three ways. Between extortion of the Ukrainians for natural resources, pressure on Ukraine to make concessions to Russia, and pressure on Russia to make concessions to Ukraine, which just ends up canceling out the pressure on Ukraine. At first, it seemed like the square was circled by creating a mineral deal in which Ukraine would give up 50% of the proceeds from mineral deposits.
Oh, by the way, this deal is now a worthless piece of paper. Okay? It's like if the piece that Trump is pushing for were to come to pass, then this is effectively a worthless piece of paper deal. It doesn't mean anything. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about this piece. Again, a lot of people that I have interviewed asked me directly, okay, why did we sign this deal? Why did we do the whole mineral deal? If it doesn't mean anything. If it's so worthless.
It actually couldn't really exploit anyway, giving the populace the appearance that they would get paid back all the money the globalists forced them to spend on Ukraine. But then the White House had to make the process so humiliating that Zelensky couldn't say yes without jeopardizing his own image.
Why don't you wear a
It wasn't just about, it's not just about that. The conditions of the deal were just too bad. Like this, it wasn't just about his image. It was about very, very objective ways in which the United States was taking advantage of Ukraine in that horrible mineral deal.
Why don't you wear a suit? You're at the highest level in this country's office, and you refuse to wear a suit. Just want to see if do you own a suit?
Yeah, problems.
A lot of Americans.
Senator Rubio, you've taken a very different approach to the question of Russia. You've called Vladimir Putin a, quote, gangster. Why would President Rubio's approach be more effective than President Trump's?
Well, first of all, I have an understanding of exactly what it is Russia and Putin are doing, and it's pretty straightforward. He wants to reposition Russia once again as a geopolitical force. He himself said that the destruction of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And now he's trying to reverse that. He's trying to destroy NATO.
Russia is also trapped in a bind. It has a large swath of territory it doesn't really want to administer and is therefore valueless to Putin. But if Russia trades that territory back to Ukraine in exchange for a promise that Ukraine will stay neutral...
That's not true, by the way. That is not true in the slightest what this person is saying here. It's not just a big swath of useless land. It's human capital that Russia also desperately wants. With occupation, you have people that you can Russify, children that you can kidnap and put to Russia and turn them into Russian citizens. Over 1 million Ukrainian children are in occupied territories right now. It's not worthless to Putin. It's actually, the worth is actually very real, believe it or not.
And maybe even recognition of Russia's claim on Crimea, they would essentially have to admit they launched the war for no reason, since they already had both of those things de facto. There's also the matter of the Russian economy, which has baffled some casual observers. With the sanctions, the flight of the professional class, and the massive divestment of resources into the war, analysts, particularly geopolitical analysts for whom economics is black magic, expected much more damage to the Russian economy. Perhaps unintuitively, the secret to Russia's resilience lies in its deep economic dysfunction. Russia is a deeply unequal country, not just in the sense that the rich are very rich and everyone else is very poor, but also geographically. The rich are concentrated in a handful of cities, and a great mass of people eke out a meager living in the provinces through a combination of odd jobs and pension checks.
Right.
That meant when Russia needed manpower, in both the trenches and the factories, they didn't have to get it by cannibalizing productive sectors of the economy. There was already a massive...
Russia has actually cannibalized the productive sectors of the economy. Russia actually was forced to do that, which is why Russia has to import workers right now. There's a big shortage in construction, for example, and in many other sectors. It's not exactly true that Russia was not forced to cannibalize those things. Like, Russia is in a demographic crisis to begin with. So it's not as peachy as this person makes it out to be for Russia. It's this aspect is a lot more painful.
Army of marginally employed provincials to pick from. The money to pay those people then came from two sources. One, seizing it from the rich, and two, printing rubles, which in effect mostly squeezes value out of Russia's small, benighted middle class, who are rich enough to have savings, but not rich enough to have it denominated in gold.
Hello, MooseWatcher123. It's been a while since I've seen you here.
Gold in a Swiss bank account. In other words, the war is providing Russia with a badly needed opportunity to redistribute wealth. In fact, in a country as unequal as Russia, it's perfectly possible that the quality of life for the median Russian has actually gone up. But that doesn't make the war sustainable. Russia still needs hard currency to buy and build weapons, and to keep its currency from collapsing. But the Kremlin doesn't get enough hard currency from oil sales to simultaneously...
Oh, the video is not over. It's still good to watch. Yeah, it's a good video to watch in the stream. Thank you. Thank you for linking it.
Maintain the welfare state, pay soldiers' salaries, and stabilize...
Going to Cuba soon, actually, for anthropological work. Ooh, nice. Very nice. Keep us posted.
The ruble all at the same time. That is, without dipping into savings, in the form of its sovereign wealth fund. After 3 years of war, it's burnt through at least half of its gold reserves. At least, that's as much as they're willing to admit. But Russia isn't just sacrificing the comfort of the oligarchs and the middle class, it's also sacrificing the sources of its long-run growth. And if the war only lasted 3 days, that would not be a problem, but long run was 3 years ago. So while Russia has been able to transition to a war economy, transitioning back into a consumption economy is a much trickier and dangerous prospect. People have higher expectations for peace than they do for war.
Which is, by the way, that is a pretty big danger of the peace plan of Trump coming through. Because according to many people, that would mean that Russia's economy would be effectively revived by the United States, while Russia would actually not be forced to end its wartime economy. Imagine that.
War. Putin will need all sanctions off in order to get back to normal, and Trump can't force the Europeans to drop their sanctions. And European sanctions aren't the only thing the EU has agency over in this conflict either. With the exception of the Patriot missiles, most of the weapons Trump might cut off can be backfilled or replaced by the Europeans. At least, if there's enough political will to pull out the
Exactly.
stops. And while the Europeans have been slow to reform in the past, a flakier, Trumpified US might finally give them the kick they need. I hope. Third time's the charm, right?
We'll see.
In fact, there's a sick way in which Trump's election might be good for Ukraine. And it goes back to what this war is fundamentally all about. You see, there's a lie the Americans started telling right around the time of the first Gulf War. It goes something like this.
What is at stake?
Vladimir, I am not surprised if it would go exactly as you say it will. And you say the next American administration is going to be like, we did nothing wrong, Russia did nothing wrong, Ukraine owes $350 billion to American taxpayers, and I'm going to be like, okay, yeah.
Is more than one small country.
Oh, sorry to hear that, Moose Watcher. Is it a very insensitive time for me to say that you should consider not being white and support your favorite journalist? You know that I'm a published journalist now, right? Support independent journalism.
It is a big idea. A new world order.
After World War II, the United States created something called the Liberal International Order, which has long guarded vigorously and consistently, and only now, in the 2020s, are we in danger of losing it.
But the greatest threat on this front springs from the distinct illiberal and external actors who equate their success with fracturing the liberal international order.
The truth is that when it comes to upholding international law, America's contribution to upholding the world order has always been scattershot and inconsistent. Even when America wants to punish a country for violating international law, it usually settles for a less than effective strategy of sanction and wait. The one alleged exception is the taboo on big countries annexing territory from small countries. The precedent set by, of course, the war to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein's unprovoked invasion, his ruthless, systematic rape of a peaceful neighbor, violated everything the community of nations holds dear. The world has said this aggression would not stand, and it will not stand.
In reality, national borders have mostly been self-reinforcing. In the age of popular participation in politics, rising nationalism, and cheap machine guns, ruling over a foreign country became more and more expensive over the course of the 20th century. The people are much less indifferent to who rules over them than they were in the 19th century. And if they don't like you, they can give you help. There are now very few things a power can get by invading and occupying a country that it couldn't more easily get through the more subtle tools of coercive diplomacy. That's why there has
Okay. I've been given this argument at the beginning of the war regarding Russia and Ukraine, that sure, Russia can invade, Russia can win even some battles, Russia can win over cities, etc., but the occupation will be too costly. People can now very cheaply, do resistance, etc., like this person said here. But the problem with this is, and I've said it all the way back in 2022, that Russia's modus operandi in these scenarios is not to just quietly rule over occupied population. Russia will mass deport and disperse the population of a given area and then just replace them with Russians. Okay? Like, that is what Russia does. That is what Russia has done many, many times before.
Hasn't been much in the way of annexation since World War II. You can see the problem in action today. In Gaza, Israel doesn't want to leave Gaza without getting some kind of concrete win, but they don't want to expend the resources that would come with an occupation. So they have simply settled for committing mass atrocities on and off until the global community, out of some sense of pity, just bails the Israelis out of their dilemma by relocating the people of Gaza for them. A bailout that is almost certainly not coming. A big three-way size disparity, like the one between America, Kuwait, and Iraq, could act as one exception, but such an alignment of circumstances is so unlikely it never happened again. Aside from Little Kuwait, the taboo on changing borders by force has been mostly self-enforcing. But it didn't hurt America's image to take credit for the kind of peaceful state of the world in the 1990s. So, they did. And now, certain people have taken America's own propaganda too seriously, and think America in decline makes all sorts of new conquests possible. The Russian theory of victory in Ukraine is based on the idea that the liberal international order is real, but somehow entirely the product of American coercion. Therefore, all they have to do is defeat the US in a battle of wills, and once Americans give up, the occupation of Ukraine will go swimmingly. Well, now the US has given up, and Ukraine is still not rolling over. The longer the Ukrainians can hold out without American help, the less credible their theory of victory becomes. And the Kremlin will eventually have to face up to the fact that they have embarked on a forever.
No, that's not true. That's actually, this video is actually posing a not true hypothesis, because Russia is actually prepared for this. That is exactly why in one of his newest speeches, Putin said, America started this war and then Europe joined in. And now Trump is president. The United States, in the eyes of Russia, has turned around. Okay, it has learned its lesson, but there's still the problem of the fear-mongering, war-mongering Europe. Now that is the main opponent. Europe has taken on the mantle of the United States. So it's still not a case of Russia saying that it's a forever senseless war, because the boogeyman has just been shifted from the United States to Europe. Easy.
This would require, needlessly, a massive sacrifice on the part of the Ukrainian people. Maybe bigger than they already have, but what choice do they have? And I just want to give a heartfelt thanks to my patrons who've been
Wait, is this over? Oh.
Next year will be more productive, I promise.
Oh, this is the end of the video. Well, that was interesting. There were a few things, at least a few things, that have pissed me off immensely about this video, but you know what? This was worth watching on stream.